Hi, this is Peter Francho, your state comptroller in Maryland. You're listening to the Conduit Street Podcast, the official podcast of the Maryland Association of Counties.
Hello and welcome to the Conduit Street Podcast. Kevin Kinnally here with Michael Sanderson. Michael, recording remotely, sort of after dark-ish, I suppose. We are recovering from crossover as we record here on Thursday the 25th. Crossover was last Monday, so a lot of action on Monday. And now as we move forward today, Michael, with crossover finished, things are becoming more clearly into focus. So we're going to run down a handful of interesting topics, quick inventory of some of the issues that we've been watching and have talked about on the podcast. We'll talk through where we are and what's left to watch. What do you think about that?
Sounds like a pretty good thing for late March. I'm in.
Let's jump right into it, Michael. Police reform. We have throughout session talked about this being one of the giant issues of the session. No surprise there. We're not alone in understanding that. Obviously, there's a lot of coverage all over the place. But I think at this point, again, crossover's done. We have two bills at this point, right? And they're pretty different. Seems like they're going to go to conference, Michael. I mean, first of all, what is conference? And talk a little bit about these two bills that have passed out of the House and the Senate.
This is a topic that probably could be an entire podcast, and we could have a couple of guests and go through this fine tooth. But let's keep it high level and talk a little about process. So the easiest path for a bill to pass is that everybody agrees on it. So the House of Delegates votes the bill out, they just support it. The Senate supports the exact same bill, and boom, you're done. But as it turns out, it's more likely, particularly on things that are complicated or have multiple parts, that you will see amendments along the way, that the committee in the House says, we want to make these 3 or 4 changes, and they recommend that. It gets accepted on the floor of the House, and then they pass an amended version of the bill, goes over to the Senate, the same bill, and then the Senate gets to consider whether they want to pass that. And frequently, the Senate will say, well, we have our own ideas. We want to change these other 3 things, so we'll amend your House bill and send it back to you. Well, the way a 2-chamber legislature is designed to work is a bill only passes if it passes in the same form out of both sides. So the House and Senate have to agree on the final version of a bill for it to be sent to the governor for a signature. So The process, like what we're going to see over the last few weeks of this session and every year at this time of year, is a lot of bills where the House and Senate have each passed their own version of the bill, but it's not yet identical. And what they'll need to do is work out the differences. The easiest mechanism to do that is you convene a committee that includes some senators and some delegates, usually from the committees that have debated and discussed the bill. You get them together to try and iron out their differences, and then they bring one final product right back to the floor of the House and the floor of the Senate for one final up or down vote. So no more changes, no more amendments. This is it. Take it or leave it. And then if both chambers agree to that final product, you have a single unified bill you can send to the governor. So that's the path we're on for many stakeholders who have been watching police reforms. We've got 2 different bills, one passed out of the Senate. Now it feels like about 2 or 2.5 weeks ago. One passed out of the House a week or week and a half ago, and they are pretty different. So they're heading in the direction of, let's appoint some leaders from each of the 2 committees, and we'll try and work out the differences and find some middle ground or find areas where the House likes some of the Senate changes or vice versa. That's the direction they're on in general.
Right. So, I mean, when it comes to legislation, I mean, let's be clear, it's pretty hard to get a bill through clean, both the House and the Senate, without any changes, any amendments. And so often now, Michael, we're going to start hearing on the floor conference committees being appointed, right? Those will be announced for bills. The House will appoint a conference committee, and so will the Senate. And the best way, I guess, to describe this is a negotiation between the House and the Senate, between those appointed members of each committee. And that's where we are, like you said, with this police bill, both in the House and the Senate. They're very different. So let's sort of walk through a high level overview of what the major differences are between the House and the Senate bill, what they did here, what their vision is of what police reform should look like in Maryland.
This is a topic we knew, not just in Maryland, but across the United States. We knew that there were going to be state legislatures, many of whom sit down in the early months of each year, each calendar year, to convene in a session like ours does. And we knew this was going to be sort of a lot of pressure coming into this session to, we want big, bold changes. And some of that has been a little bit misplaced. I mean, I've been in the Zoom hearings this year in Maryland bills where, as it turns out, there are bills introduced that really don't even correctly reference Maryland law. Like, let's get rid of qualified immunity. Well, that's actually not a thing in Maryland law.
Right.
That's an issue in other states. It's not really, practically speaking, a thing here.
This is a point where sometimes you'll get boilerplate language from someone, right, from other states, and that's sort of just looped into a bill in Maryland. And like you just said, that doesn't apply here. But we know this is a national issue, right? So I'm sure there are a lot of those boilerplate type bills that are making their way across the country. But it's important to point out that sometimes it doesn't always work. So I think that's a pretty interesting point there overall.
One of the areas where Maryland is, along with many other states, and is in the crosshairs of a lot of folks asking for big reforms, is we have currently a statewide set of laws that are bundled together, known as the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights. And it's basically procedural protections for a law enforcement officer who's charged with misconduct. What has to happen before the officer can be suspended from the job or demoted in rank or given an official, censure or other discipline measures or things like that. There's sort of some special process that an officer is entitled to. That's kind of gotten conflated with under what circumstances can we criminally charge an officer who's done something that's maybe terrible in the line of duty. And those are the high profile cases where, we see, residents being injured or killed at the hands of officers. We're saying, why isn't this person on charge for murder? The answer for that is not because of the LEOBR, that Bill of Rights law. That's because the gears of the justice system sometimes turn slowly as you go through an investigation or a grand jury or other things like that. Anyhow, those are the kind of issues that I think a lot of people feel very strongly about. I want to make sure that the police officers in our state will be held accountable if something goes terribly wrong. And if the cop didn't follow the rules, or if the cop has a pattern of being a bad guy, I want him off the force. Like that's the gut instinct that a lot of people who have been carrying signs and sort of marching on Annapolis and so forth, that's what they're really after. We know we're going to have police, but we want them to be accountable to us, and we can't have them to be a threat to our neighbors and friends. So that's
and I don't think anybody would disagree, right? Like nobody would disagree with that sentiment. But it turns out once you start digging in here and you start looking at nuts and bolts stuff, it's way more complicated than just that, right? So, and that's where I think a lot of the differences lie here.
I think so. These issues all have 2 points of view, and sometimes more than that, about what's the right thing to do. I mean, the fact of the matter is, I remember we had Everett Sesker, who works now with the local government insurance trust and does some police related training and like sensitivity training and so forth for law enforcement officers and leaders. And he kind of walked us through some of these issues, that there's different points of view here that I think are all valid. You want to have good training, you want to have good standards and accountability for your officers. But once you say, okay, like one of the elements in this bill, particularly coming out of the House, is here's going to be the new, clear, bright line standard for when you can use deadly force as an officer. And only if this has happened, only if you know this, only if you've exhausted these other options. And that sounds pretty good on paper, but then you hear actual officers and the leaders of their organizations talking about these decisions are frequently made in split seconds. standards. And, do you want to leave officers terrified to do their job for fear of reprisal or lawsuits or personal, financial responsibility, or I'll have my records opened up and I'll never be able to work in law enforcement again because in one split second I pulled the gun when I hadn't clicked every single box on this checklist. I don't know the perfect way to thread that needle, but things like use of force standards, things like the discipline and charging process for officers who are in these situations, this is the kind of stuff we mean by police reforms. And I think almost everybody, myself included, expects that they'll go through a process like a conference committee. They'll haggle through and find some middle ground on a lot of these issues, and then bring it back to the floor of the House and the Senate. Probably will be a tricky vote on the floor of the Senate in particular, that what'll probably come out will be a bigger ask for some members who weren't even thrilled about the bill that already passed the Senate floor one time. So, a lot of people will be looking at it. There's some local government issues in there. They're not really exciting to discuss. So we're modestly involved, but social justice organizations, those who represent the law enforcement officers and so forth, there's a lot of stakeholders who are like hour to hour on this issue this session.
Right, definitely. So, this is certainly one of the highest profile issues this year. We knew that, and now both the House and the Senate have passed their versions, and we're going to have to wait until a conference committee is appointed on both sides, Michael. But I think, you mentioned it, the House is certainly more aggressive in terms of what they'd like to see be done. And, we'll have to see what they can work out and essentially negotiate in conference committee. But I think it's pretty safe to say they'll pass something, correct? You think there will be a bill by sine die that pops out and everybody can sort of agree on, at least the bodies at large can agree on.
I think that's probably the direction we're headed. This is going to look a little bit, honestly, like a budget committee conference, like the budget conference committee in an ordinary year, where you have fiscal leaders from the House and Senate who have each gone through a whole budget plan, and then when they're working out differences, frequently there's some staff in the room that have this big organizing document. Here's the 62 different areas where you disagreed, and here's what the House action was, here's what the Senate action was, what do you all want to do on this topic? This could set up that way, and this could be a lengthy document that feels like a budget process, even though it's not about dollars and it's not about funding projects and so forth. It'll be about the various tenets of a use of force law, or who sits on a charging committee for cops and things like that. So I think that's the framework we've got ahead for those of us who have been along for this ride. There's a little more to go. But since I mentioned the budget framework, let me try and make an awkward segue into that, because that's one of the big things that you're invested in, watching the whole fiscal package come together. Most of those pieces are falling into place too. Is that kind of where we are now at this point?
Yeah, typically you're right. We'd be talking a lot about conference committees and the budget, and typically that's more of a drawn out process. And Michael, remember, back in July, we thought, we were looking at a really, really bad and devastating situation when it comes to the state budget. You had massive cuts proposed. And a year ago, we're looking at $6 billion in the hole, right? So right. Things have certainly changed, though, and I have to say this is probably one of the easier budgets, Michael, in terms of, me being around in Annapolis. Things are just smooth sailing, and it's remarkable to think that just back in July, we were looking at massive cuts, and here we are today, and it's relatively smooth sailing, at least for this year's budget.
I guess that's a function. You've been on the front lines here, but I guess that's a function that we're in a one-of-a-kind economic environment, right? This is a health crisis first and foremost, and that's our primary concern, is keeping people safe and healthy and trying to get people vaccinated. But it does have these really profound economic effects. And when we saw the wave of Marylanders and Americans suddenly out of work, making their first claim for unemployment insurance and so forth, it was, I remember seeing these graphs that have these huge spikes, and no one's seen a number like that before. So back in March, April, May of 2020, all the indicators were, all the economists would say, if you have that kind of unemployment, good heavens, your government revenues are going to fall apart. You better batten down the hatches and be ready to cut anything that is not absolutely essential in your operating budget. And Maryland was poised to do that, thinking, maybe this is going to send us into a terrible, terrible recession, right?
Right. And I mean, look, I think it's fair to say we still don't know what the economy truly is. I mean, we know that we've had massive federal spending sort of keep things afloat across the country, and that money has flowed in and it's worked. We had a huge bill that was passed in December. That money is coming to Maryland. It's also coming to counties and municipalities. So there's no doubt that federal spending plays a huge role in this. And when it comes to jobs, we don't know once the federal spending dries up, how many of these jobs are real. And I think we've talked about that. Yeah. Or is it just that federal money is sort of keeping people employed? So we don't know, but no doubt about it, federal money coming in has played a big role. I also think, look, Maryland is a relatively wealthy state in terms of income. So during this pandemic, unfortunately, a lot of folks in the service industries were the ones hardest hit. But a lot of people who make relatively good money were able to continue working remotely. They pay taxes, obviously. So I think that plays a big role as well. Income taxes were better than expected. So a lot of things that have really led to this. But the budget itself, I mean, you're looking at the state is just about to come into a lot of money. And Michael, I think one of the big things, and we'll talk a few minutes about what actually matters for counties here. But one of the big questions is, once this federal money comes down, and we expect it to hit the state's coffers pretty soon, who gets to decide how to spend the money? That's something that I'm looking forward to them hammering out. What are your thoughts on that in terms of, will the governor get to decide because the General Assembly is outside of session, or will the General Assembly try to put some guardrails up there, do you think?
It seems possible. It seems to me that there's still time in this legislative session for the General Assembly to try and put a stamp on the spending plan for the next year or two, while as this federal support starts to flow. And we know that there's going to be a great deal of support that comes to the state government, and a lot of that is meant to be transferred on to businesses that are in need or to residents who are in need and so forth. So it's not just like this is all money going into a bureaucracy for nameless, faceless nothing. It's meant to be transferred to prop up the economy, to patch us over this unusually difficult time. So I think we'll probably see more of the same, what we've seen for the last number of months. But for the General Assembly to show up and say, here are 8 things or 14 things that we think are, all, here's the green light to spend the money on these things, maybe within certain limits or within certain, boundaries or whatnot. I don't know what that might look like specifically. We've seen at least one bill introduced along these lines that hasn't received any attention, but there's 2 or 3 weeks left in session. There's still an opportunity for some attention, I think.
Yeah, definitely still some time there. I mean, when it comes to counties, Michael, we were mostly focused on the Budget Reconciliation Financing Act. That's sort of the bill that accompanies the budget bill to balance everything out. The good news is we got everything we asked for. There were some proposals to shift some costs onto counties. One of the biggest deals, Michael, is community colleges. And there was proposals sort of to cut them and then cut them in the out years. The General Assembly restored those cuts. And then also, for the first time ever, the General Assembly, it seems, they're signaling that they're going to fully fund their share of the CAID funding formula. That is sort of the state, the counties, and then tuition. The state has never been able to get there. They've pushed it down the road multiple times, but it's looking like the state is going to fully fund its share. So it's a big deal for community colleges. Obviously, we play a big role in their funding. And when the state's funding is not there, they typically come to counties to make up the lost funds from the state. And then, of course, they don't want to raise tuition, but that would be the other option. So I don't want that to get lost in the shuffle. That's a big deal this year. And certainly the General Assembly is signaling that they're going to do that and live up to their full share of CAID.
This is exactly the right time to show up for these institutions that can deliver close to home. And when we know we have an awful lot of our our neighbors and people in our community who are underemployed or unemployed. I mean, a community college is the perfect place to go and pick up some new skills to find yourself better positioned when this economy sort of opens back up, right? So, the idea of the 2-year schools that have some things that are pretty functional in nature, that you can take nursing classes and so forth, or work on an associate's degree and build your business acumen, or culinary skills. There's the whole laundry list of things that 2-year schools are really good at, and to make sure that those are robust offerings ready for people who right now may find themselves with less travel time. They may be between jobs or underemployed right now. This is the perfect time for some people to get some retraining and education and sharpen the saw, so to speak.
No doubt about it. So I think that the bottom line here, Michael, overall, pretty easy budget year. Lots of the focus is on federal funds. They're certainly not in crisis, as we may have thought just back in July, not in hack and slash mode. So good news there. So Michael, the federal money, of course, is because of the pandemic. We are still dealing with the pandemic. Hopefully there is light at the end of the tunnel as more folks get vaccinated. But what bills are still alive, Michael, dealing with COVID? We know that's also one of the biggest issues this session. What are we seeing here when it comes to the Senate?
It did feel like a whole wave of legislation being introduced in the first week of the session that dealt with, well, what about the COVID effect on this or that? It just felt like there were dozens of different bills, and I think they're all over the General Assembly. It's not like these are all budget issues or they're all employment issues. They're scattered. One of the things that I've been following is, will the legislature sort of build something of a game plan for what the state's response is going to look like for the months ahead? We've had, let's face it, we've had frustrations over a variety of things, but lately the vaccination rollout has left some of our county leaders frustrated about how the allocations have been inconsistent. We've been concerned that the federal government has left us in the lurch, not knowing what our share is going to be week to week. Where the sites are and how residents can go about registering and pre-registering, and then what happens if you've registered in 3 places and other things like that. We've had so many nuts and bolts problems. The Senate has moved a bill that sort of creates, I guess a game plan is the right word for what the state's approach to testing and tracing will continue to look like. I guess you got differences of opinion about how important testing is going to be going forward, but I think there's still a role for that. But also vaccinations. We're in the throes of an all-out effort to get everybody who wants to be vaccinated their opportunity to do so, and our public health leaders are talking in really hopeful terms that it's going to be a matter of weeks, not months, before the big numbers of Marylanders have been able to get their immunization shot. So let's hope that's what happens, but it's a logistical challenge, it's a communications challenge, and we may need to do further if we end up with variants and strains that challenge our resistance capacities. Maybe this is an ongoing thing. So the Senate has put out a bill that's some of the nuts and bolts going forward, but having put their stamp on it. So I think that's one of the things that is alive, and our public health professionals are engaged on that. There's things at multiple levels, right? You've been watching some of this other stuff too, right?
Right. So, I mean, there is still a lot of work, a lot of subcommittee work and work groups going into the numerous bills that deal with workplace protections and benefits when it comes to COVID, and when a person should be able to say, I don't feel comfortable, I don't want to come to work, how much people should be paid that are sort of the essential workers, right? And there's a lot going into that, and that has really not been worked out yet. So a lot to come there, Michael, and there are a couple big issues still to be ironed out there. One of them is liability, and you've been keeping an eye on that too.
I think I've probably flipped on this issue. Early in session, I thought MACo came to the table and supported a couple of bills, and there were a number of stakeholders who did so, saying we're really afraid of a wave of lawsuits arising from people who end up getting COVID, right? And if you say I got sick and now I'm mad because I feel like I might have gotten exposed at work, so I want to sue my employer. Okay, well, I mean, this is the county podcast. County governments are employers, and we might very well have categories of people who are in essential jobs that we couldn't just shut down. You can't just shut down the 911 call center, right? But to the extent that people need to be at the place where all that technology is, does it expose them to some risk? Maybe. And is that an unreasonable risk in the workplace? Maybe. So, maybes are really fertile ground for lawsuits. At one point, I thought there was a chance for some state legislation to say, to sort of try and tamp down the potential nuisance lawsuits. Let's just throw something in and see if we can get 60 grand. That's the kind of thing that really worries employers, including counties, an awful lot. I think that has been so fraught with difficulties. I think it's unlikely we're going to see one of those broad bills show up to grant some liability protection. We talked with Piggy and Townsend from the hospital side of the universe about the same kind of issues, about medical decisions made in the midst of COVID. They're worried about liability too. I don't think we're going to see a big umbrella on that front. So let's hope our worst fears aren't realized and we don't end up with a giant wave of litigation in the fallout after this terrible pandemic. It's bad enough that our neighborhoods have been ravaged by illness and so forth. But yeah, I mean, I agree with you on the workplace issues. Those are still thorny, still getting sorted out. So lots of bills introduced, not quite as many passing.
Right. So a lot to work out there for sure. And that's going to be a focus as we head into the last few weeks of session, of course, along with police reform. We talked about that still hanging out there as well. Let's talk about some of the other interesting issues kicking around, Michael. We've talked on here before about sports wagering. And look, we know that the voters in Maryland approved the idea, the general concept. It was going to be up to the General Assembly to decide how to do this. And it looks like, Michael, a bill is coming together on how to implement sports wagering in Maryland. And of course, one of the biggest issues is, the license holders, right? Do the casinos get to do this? Can there be off-track betting? We have, the FanDuels and DraftKings of the world, the mobile apps, and they can geo-fence. But it looks like this is starting to come together, Michael, in the House and the Senate.
It does seem that way. So, I mean, this is something that probably it's a revenue source, but not a gigantic one, right? It's not like, if we make it legal in Maryland to bet on the Orioles, then suddenly we can pay for the Kerwin plan, right? This isn't that kind of thing, but it is one of these things that since the federal laws have sort of cleared a path for states to authorize this, we've got an opportunity to do that. So it looks like we may see the pieces come together this year. I'm reasonably optimistic that'll happen. I think we've mentioned that, trying to figure out what's going to be the year and when might it come together, also with an eye toward federal law, has been adult use cannabis. We've mentioned it a couple times just because it's another high profile topic. We've seen a number of other states either pass this as a ballot question or just do it through their state legislature. At least one or two states have done that. And I think we sat down and did an around the horn back in January or early February and sort of shrugged our shoulders and said, don't know whether this will be the year. I think if this were the year, there would be more motion by now. So I think we can probably call this one as adult use cannabis, not this session, it appears. But the gears may still be turning on this issue, maybe pointing toward the 2022 session. And lo and behold, that would be a state election year. So potential for that to still be the legislature passes something, but frames it as either a constitutional amendment or otherwise something that would end up on the November 22 ballot. So I think that's a decent prediction for what's going to happen on this issue. The debate's not over. It's just not ripe yet this year, it looks.
No doubt about it. It's not if, but when. And if you're interested, I would ask people to go ahead and Google what's going on in New York. They've come to sort of an agreement, but there are a lot of factors that have to go into this. And I agree with you. This looks like it's going to be a ballot issue, Michael. And of course, another interesting issue that is kicking around, the school funding bill, Kerwin, Michael, this is sort of the fix-it bill. I have to tell you, I'm really glad that I'm off the Kerwin beat. I mean, of course, I miss it, but I wasn't sad to hand over the reins. But look, we know that we passed the big blueprint bill to implement the Kerwin Commission's recommendations. We've talked about that ad nauseum on this podcast over the past few years. But because of the pandemic, Michael, there were some issues in terms of some technical fixes that had to be made. That bill is still kicking around. Michael, what's the latest with that?
I think it's coming together. This one looks like it's on a fast track to pass. So when you reference like there's some, because of the pandemic, there's a couple things that have necessitated a sort of cleanup bill. Number one, just the timing of last year's Kerwin bill becoming law, because the governor vetoed the bill back in the spring, and then the General Assembly didn't meet until January. That means that the governor introduced the FY22 budget, which would have been the first year of the Kerwin plan. He introduced the budget before the Kerwin bill became law. So you end up in this really tricky situation, right? I know we've talked on this podcast about how Maryland has this peculiar budget process where the current year's spending, really the governor holds all the cards. And back in last year's session, they could have mandated that for this year's budget, the governor do X, Y, and Z. But because the bill had not passed, he introduces a budget under the laws as they were at the time. And they can't pass a new bill to say, now go back in time and fix that. But so what we've seen is, okay, there's an appetite to, all right, we're going to push back some of the components of this multi-year plan, kind of skip the FY22 budget, which is going to work out okay, and then change a few of the expectations. But meanwhile, we also had our annual count of students in September 2020, and in a pandemic year with so many students remote, when we counted heads and kids in seats, we ended up in some jurisdictions, they're down 4%, down 6%, down 10% in their enrollment count. So if you figure that a lot of those kids are temporarily being homeschooled or temporarily in private schools that have been able to go face-to-face or something like that, then you have to figure those kids are probably going to come back to the public schools. At least most of them will. So wow, you'd have a real aberration in all the various formulas that are based on enrollment counts. So, wring your hands over that for a while. And if you think through all the nuts and bolts, that's complicated. So that's another thing to tidy up. Basically, there's a bill moving through the legislature to clean up those loose ends, to basically say, all right, all these references to FY22, we'll make these things start in FY23. We'll change the phase-in periods. We'll adjust some timetables. We'll tidy up some technical references. And that enrollment count in September 2020, for all intents and purposes, we're going to just ignore that enrollment count and basically reference the year before and, you sort of tidy up loose ends around that so you don't end up with all your formulas driven nuts by one weird year of kid counts. So that's a long-winded way of saying it's a technical cleanup bill that looks to be on its way towards passing. It's on the floor of the Senate. It's already passed the House. I don't think this will turn into a conference committee back and forth. It's much more likely that the House will just accept the changes that the Senate is putting on the bill now, and this will be a done deal.
No doubt. I agree with you there. And then, let's leave on a weird / light note, Michael. I mean, we see local bills every year, right? And look, for people that are just tuning in right now, they may be asking, why are all these county bills all over the place? I mean, particularly in this session, I feel like, Michael, there's been so much discussion about local courtesy and all these local bills and how the General Assembly should treat them and handle them. I mean, What is, I mean, look, I just don't think they've talked about it to this extent before, but it's normal to have a lot of local bills, which are a county decides they'd like to do something, they go to their delegation, a bill gets introduced, and a lot of the times you see this with liquor bills, right? And that's its own animal.
Oh,
But
geez, yeah.
talk a little bit about, the history here and what is, local courtesy and how does that all play in? Particularly this session has been a lot, it seems like.
This is probably its own podcast to bring in a learned guest or two and talk about how all this evolved. But I mean, in the practical sense, county governments are in some ways autonomous units, and we get to make our own decisions. We pass our own budgets and a variety of things along those lines. But depending on the structure of your county government, there are some issues that your county still needs to come to the state legislature and have the state change the laws so you can do something, or so you can, launch a new program or change a tax rate or whatever. And some of these things are unbelievably tiny, right? I mean, we see a bill introduced in the whole state legislature to change the state's attorney's salary in one random county from $90,000 to $94,000 because some local commission said that's what we should do, right? And they can't just do it locally, even though it's all being paid for out of the county budget. They have to trot up to Annapolis, file some blue pieces of paper, have it introduced as a bill, and debated and considered by the entire General Assembly. So that's where this starts, is we have some counties who don't even enjoy this concept of home rule, and they need the General Assembly to authorize tons of stuff. But even our biggest, most sophisticated, the charter counties, even the charter counties sometimes still need authority from the state to do something new or something that hasn't been explicitly authorized. So in every year when there are 2,500, 3,000, 3,500 bills, there are hundreds and hundreds of local bills. And imagine if you're the senator from Garrett and Allegheny County, and you're a member of the Senate, and the day's calendar includes, here's a bill from Carroll County, here's a bill from Cecil County, here's the whole slate of different bills from Dorchester County, and it's just one after another, all these different local bills. Do you really want to roll up your sleeves and get into the debate about what the state's attorney's salary ought to be in Cecil County? That bill, you got to vote on that bill. Do you really want to get into all that stuff? Do you want to read the report of every county all these different study groups and stuff? Probably not, right?
Right.
So I mean,
this year, though, more so than normal, I'd have to say.
Well, in general, what's evolved over time is that the easiest way to handle these local issues is, listen, when I represent Garrett County out here, when my Garrett County bill shows up, I'm going to explain to you all why you should vote for it. And I'll ask you to I know what's going on the ground in Garrett County, so I'll be the one who can sort of be the expert on the Garrett County bill. And if you represent Cecil, you can explain to me the Cecil County bill. And you know what? I'm going to defer to what you tell me makes sense for Cecil, and I'll ask you to defer to me on what makes sense for Garrett. So that sort of informal handshake has over the years turned into a pretty formal and pretty well-respected concept of local courtesy. That if the delegation for the county affected by a local bill supports the bill, that's good enough for me. And you will return the favor when I have my local bill that's over in your committee. You don't want to get into a big debate about a local county, a single county bill. You just sort of say, hey, if the delegates who represent there, if they support this bill, that's good enough for me. I support the bill. But what if single county effect isn't quite as clear as, what's the salary of one employee, or we'll add one more license or something along those lines, right? That's when this gets tricky.
Right. And we've seen a number of those issues this year, but, I agree with you. It could be a whole episode and we could have people on here that can talk about the history, and really the local courtesy was designed to move things along because, like you just said, the idea would be that, you're representing that jurisdiction, what's going on, and I'll have a bill and you're going to do the same for me. The idea is to move it along, but there are some tricky issues that you can get into with quote unquote a local bill and how that happens. But I mean, where do you draw the line? And I guess that's sort of an evolving conversation. And I think this year particularly, we've seen a lot of those questions pop up, and what counts as a local bill, what is local courtesy, what should you do, what should you not do. So a lot of that stuff, I just feel like they've talked about it more this year than I've ever heard before. And it's just pretty fascinating as, the folks that represent counties, and you're sort of listening and all of a sudden you hear about a local bill and there's people standing up and you're like, whoa. This is complicated, right? We're not used to this. So interesting debate for sure this year, more so than normal, I'd say.
I think in an ordinary year, there are literally scores of single county bills that pass without as much as a whimper. And they're all, just like we're going to add 2 more Class B wine and beer licenses in Carroll County and that sort of stuff. And it all just sort of trudges along and everybody defers to local courtesy. I think this year we've heard more stand up on the floor, ask a question about the ramifications of this local bill, and does this affect, what if I'm driving through your county, will this still affect me on the roads there? And like, if the answer is yes, then suddenly it's kind of a political free-for-all. Is this really a local bill if it can affect me as I visit? And so, anyway, I think there's been more conversation about the substance of these local courtesy issues that call into question, is this a system that can continue in an immaculate fashion, or are we going to be scratching at this itch for forever?
Yeah, so certainly more to come there. It's something I think we'd like to cover after session is done. But bottom line, Michael, as we head into the final weeks of session, a lot of stuff is done and a lot of bills have passed. The budget is going to be easy. A couple high-profile issues still hanging out there. Any closing thoughts before we wrap it up for today?
No, I think just we had our legislative committee for MACo. We did another virtual meeting. Sadly, we're not yet in a state to be able to meet face to face and do that in a spaced and safe way, but still got everybody plugged in to give them an update a little bit along the lines of what we're doing here. I'm happy that we got so much participation and guidance from our elected officials through this session. This is a weird year in a lot of ways, and we've talked about this in a variety of ways on the podcast. But I will say, doing things remotely has actually been a boon for participation in a lot of ways. And this year we probably had an extra, I don't know, what would you say, maybe like an extra 10 or 15 elected officials from our counties who have been able to, like, I can get on a Zoom meeting. Like, I can't take a whole Wednesday off and drive 2 hours each way to get to Annapolis to do, a couple hours worth of meetings. But just be on the Zoom thing and be part of the conversation. Oh, I can do that. And we've been the better for it, I think, having a little broader participation. And, when we have guests, some more questions coming from other members, I think that's been a plus. In a tough year, you look for silver linings. So I find one there. Participation, good thing.
Definitely. And I think the General Assembly would say the same about folks who are able to testify remotely. It's so easy to not have to take a full day off and come down to Annapolis and maybe wait out a few hours outside of a committee. You can just Zoom in, and when your name is called, you get to testify. So I think across the board, it'll be interesting to see how that is handled moving forward. But you mentioned county elected officials and the input that they provide being so important. I also want to say the county professional staff has been essential for all of us, right? We rely on them. They're the experts back at home, whether it be in budget or environment, permitting, whatever the case may be. They have been essential this year, particularly. So
sure.
Shout out to them as well, right? Big
No
deal.
doubt.
The elected officials and the professional staff.
Oh man, I don't know what I would have done without, especially this year our health officers have been up to their eyeballs in. I mean, they're trying to deal with the pandemic, but then also I keep shipping out all these different bills talking about, well, what about this and what about that? And they've been enormously helpful in guiding us along in multiple ways. So anyway, it's a great team we get to be part of.
Absolutely. And that's a good way to end this episode of the podcast. As always, if you enjoy the podcast, please go ahead and subscribe. That way, all of these episodes will be sent directly to the device of your choice. You can also follow along on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and then, of course, the Conduit Street blog. Michael will be back with more updates as the General Assembly rounds out its session. But for Michael Sanderson, this is Kevin Kinnally signing off, and we will talk to you soon.